A great welcome, dear guests of the Spiritual Channel. And also welcome to the 20th sequence of this famous series of videos. It is titled O2O, Apocalypse. And that is our topic now to be treated. So we start right away with it. Apocalypse is the ancient Greek term for revelation or disclosure. In particular, however, the term marks the last part of the Bible. For this part deals with the revelation of John, which contains a spiritual visionary show. Especially in modern times, the apocalypse term is often used for a terrible end time. This is what we call super-regional, devastating catastrophes of apocalyptic dimensions. But the origin of the term, with the biblical revelation of John, is known to very few people. Also, the well-known TV productions about the subject were made by people who apparently have no idea for the matter. Because the apocalyptic central figure, the Lamb itself with the sealed book, remains completely in the dark with you. Let alone that they would have understood at all the whole context of the visionary's events. All of what they are able is to illustrate the bare fright events and comment with the revelation texts. According to the tradition, John on the island Patmos had received visionary's central insights. So, an insight into the world history, the humanity and future concerning. There one says in Revelation chapter 1, verse 1, the revelation of Jesus Christ, which God gave him to show to his servants what must soon take place. And he made it known by sending his angel to his servant John. And in Revelation chapter 22, verse 6, it sounds quite similar. And he said to me, these words are trustworthy and true. And the Lord, the God of the spirits of the prophets, has sent his angel to show his servants what must soon take place. When it says soon, or in the shortness, then of course that has to affect the future. But with the enormous wealth of shown events, then all this fits into no short period of time. Hence, it becomes clear that the events must relate to the entire history of mankind. So, about the time since the Homo sapiens sapiens was appearing on this planet. According to the natural law that all living have to eat for staying alive, the entire world evolution is to see as a single huge orgy of violence. Likewise, according to the big banging self-repulsion of the world originator, under constant temporal becoming and passing, the revelation of John shows impressively that, with an extrasensory transcendental ability, then in principle, the future can be seen. As a conclusion, it necessarily follows that from a higher perspective, our present must be the past. Time relationships cannot be perceived in everyday life, because they are regularly beyond of consciousness. But, with paranormal abilities, as in the case of the seer John, a temporal overview can become possible, and the future can be perceived. Anyway, is according to the causality law, the end effect produces the beginning, or primordial cause, so that the time expiry is compelling predetermined, and of therefore the future can be seen. The definiteness of the world event is likely to destroy just around all the illusions about freedom, which has the ordinary citizen in general. E.B.
This coincides with the latest medical knowledge, gnosis. Since the free will was recognized as a mere illusion in this manner that is not the conscious self which decides. Obviously, these are unconscious neural processes that form the decision in advance. That is then unconsciously taken over by the conscious self and given out as an own free decision. But, of course, conversely, for reciprocity, the mode of own thinking and action that has taken place will form one's own unconscious. So it is ultimately the decision from the own self, if otherwise can be excluded, for an influence. In any case, it is clear that we have to be in constant contact with our environment for information and exchange. Then the question would be to what extent the external influences can determine our thoughts and actions. That is certainly individual and always very different depending on the situation. All in all, the share of freedom in your own decision will generally be rather low. If you then still the causality law into account in its universality, one can in principle bury the will freedom. For then the entire world event is subject to this one and only purpose of law. And a breakout or deviation from it is simply not possible. As a heading could be formulated, the world faithfully caught in the causality law. So the free choice of the individual is limited to its agreeing with it or also not. The situation, however, would either way would have not the slightest change. Therefore, one can get a notion why the entire world history from a higher vantage point is definite and thus can be seen in principle. If the end effect has to provide the initial cause, then it means compellingly absolute directedness and determination, and distended to the entire evolutionary process since start of the Big Bang. There is no doubt about such directedness in cosmology, which is known as the entropic principle. A paranormal seer, such as John on Patmos, is thus fundamentally capable of a supernatural insight into the whole world event. So, an insight into the world and human history within the framework of the causality law and its alignment of everything. By necessity of a universal person as the end effect, the causality law in his capacity becomes the originator and mediator of such knowledge. Therefore, John of Patmos derives his knowledge directly from this universal person as the world originator. Because of his time-spanning transcendence, the world originator can therefore never directly and personally appear in the time gnosis. Spiritual outflows from him represent him, which are known from the Bible as angels and similar beings.
There it says of the one who is there, and who was there, and who comes. This description puts the world originator above present, past, and future, and with it, above the time as such. That corresponds to the hypertemporal zero as beginning and ending in one point with the cycle as a result. The circulation follows again from the causality law, so with the end, or final, effect, performing the beginning cause. Because of this, we can assume that John actually had to do with his vision with the hypertemporal world originator, and not with the fantasy product of the brain which is out of control. Even more clearly becomes the anyway quite being enough proof with the following text from the Revelation in chapter 1, verse 8. I am the Alpha and the Omega, says the Lord God, who is, and who was, and who is to come, the Almighty. This is once more the proof of the universal, hypertemporal zero point from the causality law, as well as a universal person as the originator of the world. Hence, the complete apocalypse text, subjectively experienced by John, can be valid as an objective reality. However, as a true reality, which cannot be accessible to a normal consciousness. Moreover, the events are shrouded in a pictorial language, using many symbols, which must remain incomprehensible without explanation. And that is precisely the reason of the sequence, with a focus on the core events of the apocalypse, for a required clarification. In doing so, we go beyond the bewildering symbolism and deal only with the underlying facts and contents. They can be explained by a few key symbols, as listed below. As for symbols, we have the 7 spirits of God, then the Lamb of God, with his book of the 7 seals, then the beast, as well as the New Jerusalem. As John is told, right from the beginning, the vision is about an outlook on future events concerning God and the world. Although this vision is incomprehensible for all its puzzling details, it can provide comfort and confidence to believers. It can now be said that it is this huge symbolization that gives as result 7 seals and makes the book illegible. Accordingly, the vision deals almost entirely with solving the 7 seals, and the book itself remains in the dark until the end of the vision. From it follows that the book is a symbol for the world clarification, which is presented by the world originator to a world declining him shortly before the end of time world. Namely, because the world originator presents his publications not as an omnipotent God, but as a powerless normal person. Evie, you will certainly know it, why this is so.
Diagnosis, so to speak, first-hand, through one's own view. Well, in the apocalypse, the world originator is the slaughtered lamb, who is the only one worthy to get the 7-sealed book in his hands. The symbol is completely understandable, because only the world originator himself can be able to explain his self-reasons and the world reasons. For only he alone can know how it had come in time to his hypertemporal founding of self and world. The end effect which the beginning has to accomplish is recognizably a temporal matter and not a matter of eternity. In the world of eternity, the world originator is the Almighty, who has in the time developed his self-reasons and world reasons temporally. However, not there as Almighty God, but on the contrary, as a powerless average person. For him, as universe in person, a time abidance automatically means his personal dividedness over everything in the universe. And that's almost exactly what the Apocalypse says in Revelation chapter 5, verse 6. It can be seen as a slaughter when the universe is first embodied in a person, virtually as a kind of spiritual concentrate. And then, in a kind of reversal, the person loses its identity by spreading its identity to everything in the universe. What is meant is the self-identity of the world originator as the Almighty, which is symbolized in the Apocalypse as his 7 spirits. On the white throne, called in the text, he sits transcendent from beginning to ending during the entire expiry of the Big Bang and world developing. After his universal act in the hypertemporal zero, he returns from there to the time, because only therein can be possible a comprehensive clarification and detection of self and world. But time means basically the moments of a hypertemporal existence temporally apart to have. When additionally the personal identity is handed over to the entire universe, then only a powerless average man remains. In this existence form, he can use a remaining time for a special purpose, which is to open up the entire self and world complex. And so, as that was seen in the Apocalypse around the seal book, it is also that what the universe awaits from him. He has this task to accept as a temporal commitment and finally to operate until the fulfillment. Because the self-involved creation at the same time is also creation of time and space, then the reflection on it is bound on time and space. The factually necessary clarification of the self and world origination stands in opposition to the freedom of the Almighty. For the freedom of the Almighty knows, of course, no factual constraints. Also, there is in the eternity world no occasion why there the Almighty should deal with the reasons of his self and world. This is clearly a matter of time, where absolutely everything has to come into existence. This includes the Almighty with his self-clarification as a normal citizen, so that only with the conclusion of this clarification the time world can get its end. Because the completion of the time world encompasses the entire time world, it will concern each of its moments. That is why the formula used in the revelatory text for the entire Big Bang period is "See, I will come soon." For the end of the time world comes not only at the end of time, but also in simultaneousness for all its moments, as it dictates the zero selectivity.
That's the whole point, Evie, where everyone thought, a so-called soon, that in the time after Jesus has not come, that also will not come in the future. Even now, the knowledge of the 0 point, as the all and nothing in one, is in its mathematical abstractness, hardly to conciliate and conceivable. And then also, that everything in the universe, in its temporal sequence, is terminated by this 0 point at the same time. Then there is valid the apocalyptic, "See, I will come soon," generally always, at any time, in any place, and so, quasi till time ending. And when is the end of the time world, with the last second? The Apocalypse connects the end of the time world with the fate of the Lamb, and thus with its temporal end. This is also perfectly logical that the time world finishes with the temporal end of its originator. For he is the embodiment of the universe, and that, in its temporal totality, from beginning till the ending. And all the more, because directly after his world basic act, the world originator had defined his heart as the time. However, with ingress of the world originator in the time, his universal identity was distributed over the entire universe. What the Apocalypse rightly sees as a sort of slaughter or dismemberment. If then the temporal end of the Lamb is at the same time also the end of the time world will show when this time comes. If the time world continued, then it would be clear that its end is linked to the end of general life in space. Because then, in general, only any or some heart, with its pulsating stroke, is the decisive criterion. So, the criterion for time, as it had defined the universal originator in the 0 point, for himself. And there, his heart is the universal heart, as it is beyond the human heart, typical of any kind of multicellular higher life. But the apocalypse has only humanity to its subject, in conjunction with the Lamb, as the end time. Therefore, based on the apocalypse scenario, I type that the temporal end of the Lamb, at the same time, also closes the time world. How this end of the time world will happen describes the apocalypse with a number of images and symbols. In plain language, this probably concerns a fundamental change of consciousness as a result of a sudden, polar other-world perception and self-perception. May be comparable to the experience of a blind born when he, as an adult, is able to see from one moment to the next. A superpositive change in consciousness promises the apocalypse to anyone who puts himself in time on the side of the temporal Lamb. This process depends on a self-overcoming, which also takes place as a world overcoming. This is to be taken from several revelatory verses where it says in plain text, "Who overcomes," and so on. So, anyone who overcomes the self and the world generally receives a reward which irrevocably validates his existence for all time. In particular, the reward is a participation in the life and the world of the timeless Almighty. Can one understand the revelatory verses in this way, Evie?
Without any doubt, these promises, in case of overcoming, make a such participation in the universal person certain. But what also becomes very clear is that the individual has his fate completely in his own hands. Namely, that fate which concerns the value of his entire life and at the same time also that of his spirit and soul. Because it is clear that temporal hits of fate are unlikely to be prevented with a mere change of attitude. And naturally, for a good reason, because there have to be real hurdles for true self and world overcoming. As always, here too, nothing can come from nothing. How high the obstacles or hurdles have to be, though that an overcoming can be effective, is individually very different. This raises the question of how much and what someone has all to suffer, so that it comes to a change of his personality at him. In the text of Thomas, Jesus says that you have to make yourself completely empty in order to receive the light. So, by kind of psychodramatic self-emptying, to liberate his soul for the absorption of the universal spirit. As a liberation from all the constraints and restrictions with which the person is held captive by itself and the world. That is what I see as the overcoming demanded by the apocalypse. If that is intellectually too high to be understood, then you should tackle your overcoming by an inner impulse. And just follow then your feeling and your intuition as far they are able to show you the way. According to the Revelation verses, the huge number of people mentioned there is the complete human race. For example, Revelation chapter 7, verse 9, where it says, with using symbols. After this I looked, and behold, a great multitude, which no man could number, from every nation, from all tribes and peoples and tongues, standing before the throne and before the Lamb, clothed in white robes, with palm branches in their hands. Because with the spreading of the spiritual and personal identity of the world originator over the entire universe as an advance, it only needs the good will of the individual. So the will of everyone to get contact with the world originator, which is transcendent, present in all people, do his complete distribution over the entire universe. If this is realized, a mental process will start which will show obstacles and hurdles that need to be overcome. Then related to the individual life, an equally individual self-overcoming and overcoming of the world can take place, gnosis. The Apocalypse uses the symbol of clothing washing with the blood of the Lamb for this self and world overcoming. It is clear that without the temporal abandonment of his universal identity, the world originator would remain alien to his property or his world, which would be equivalent to a lasting contradiction and opposition. The identity of the world originator fills with its division and distribution the complete universe, what opens the entire universe the possibility to search for and to find the contact to its originator. In general, one can only understand the symbols and images used in the Apocalypse if one knows the basic facts of the world origination. I always find it grotesque when in TV productions about the Apocalypse the images and symbols used in it are staged optically, without being able to explain even in the slightest of the pictures and symbols, but that is also clear. For there is no interest for that, because humanity refuses its originator, for which the Apocalypse uses the symbol of the hostile animal. Example, Revelation chapter 17, verse 13, where it is said, "These are of one mind, and give over their power and authority to the beast. They will make war on the Lamb, and the Lamb will conquer them." Do you notice anything of this fight, gnosis?
Certainly, I only have to look at the statistics for our channel, EB. Because, so to say, in this statistics, that apocalyptic animal is grinning into our face, for which there are quite a few indications. But here, I do not want to enlarge closer on it, because it brings actually nothing. Also, the polarity in existence is valid for everything, no matter in what respect, and therefore in every respect. In that regard, everything that appears there also has its deeper meaning and justification, which one must know and respect. Finally, the universe is a system, as you demonstrate it in your book of the same name, EB. In this system, absolutely nothing is accidental, because everything is integrated into the system, contributing to the functioning of the system. This is reason enough for us to endure opposition, enmity, and ignorance with relative serenity. After all, you have previously cited that although the enemies of the Lamb with him wage war, the Lamb will prevail and win. The mankind which has washed its clothes in the blood of the Lamb is the identical which fought before against the Lamb. The identity of the world originator, which is superimposed over the universe with the sending of the Spirit over everything, ultimately replaces each of these enemies with the originator himself. Better said, his personal identity replaces those of his enemies, whose identity is based on their hostile self-perception and world perception. It is the polar self and world perception of the world originator, which ultimately takes place abruptly in the enemies, what makes their opposition disappearing to nothingness. But why does this enmity exist, not from a systemic point of view, but from a human point of view? There I think it is like a situation where a living person hates his life because he knows that it is taken from him unavoidably with his death. And that life could go beyond death, one can neither understand nor believe for many reasons. As I said, everything is a matter of consciousness, where a change cannot be achieved without a necessary self and world overcoming. Sacrificial achievements and overcomings for a higher are generally undesirable because one wants to enjoy his lifetime, what amounts to a pact with the death. All of this is very understandable, but not future-oriented, because with temporal end of the ineffectuated world originator, the time world has gotten its last moment. Bottom line, the apocalypse wants to shake up by saying that a passing time world takes everything with it into decline, where there is no share in the Lamb. For this purpose, an unmanageable abundance of symbols and images is offered, which should clarify the seriousness of the situation. And, above all, also the huge importance, insofar when with the world originator as the universe in person, from him and before him, no escape can be possible. To say a blind person that it is vital for him to be able to see if he has never seen can hardly be helpful. And to persuade him to do everything on his own to be able to see is relatively hopeless. But at least the revelation of John had achieved to be affiliated up in the Bible as its last book. Even if by the believers of all the picture symbolism, practically nothing is to be turned to account and to be understood. At least for us, the Apocalypse is not a book with 7 seals. We are therefore aware of its extraordinary importance, which is why we have dedicated it here and on sequence. Undoubtedly, the Apocalypse is a prophecy, because in the Revelation texts it is said what is to happen in the near future. And with what is to be expected in the near future, it could only be wise and reasonable to prepare to the end of the world. The time world end has recognizably not entered till present yet, because, obviously, the world originator with himself is not yet at the end. This 7 times sealed book is an impressive symbol for the complexity and abstractness of the existence at all. Is the all-existence, in fact, so inscrutable to the general public, as these 7 seals do that suggest?
If you know once all the speculation around the Big Bang, one soon becomes clear that there can be no different. According to the vision of John exclusively, the world originator is required to detect the world's reasons and then make them public. Because, as it is said in Revelation chapter 5, verse 1 through 11, only he alone has the dignity to take over the task and to fulfill. The reasons for his dignity are, on the one hand, the world origination, which he operates per Big Bang as transcendent world originator. And second, there is the temporal loss of his personal identity, through which mankind acquires its share in his person. All in all, an absolute world-class performance of the world originator, to which no other person would have been able to do so except for him. The revelation of this forces all observers into wholeheartedly ecstatic worship, because this acceptance and acknowledgement arises from the realization that without this man, instead of light existence, would only be dark nothingness. So an unconscious darkness, as we know, for example, from the deepest sleep or the coma. However, it is not this knowledge alone that leads to worship. It is the deepest emotional fulfillment that arises by experiencing of his universal spirit as the seven mentioned spirits of God. If you look at world history, so it can be reduced to a single criminal orgy of violence. Civilization with law and order forms only a kind corset to enable survival of mankind. But in the nuclear age, with the weapons of mass destruction, survival has become a game of chance. And so the apocalypse never tires of showing the mass of threats with its symbols and images. Dangers that come from nature, such as catastrophe, illness, distress, and death. And on the other hand are man-made, such as wars, oppression, slavery, exploitation, and so on. Resulting from that world evolution with its selections must be effective until the last moment of time. And with it the struggle for survival of each individual from birth to death, open visible or hidden invisibly. But with the temporal end of the world originator comes simultaneously the end of the time world, which puts an end to the raging battle for survival. Alone this liberation from survival burden, which is then immediately felt and experienced by everyone and everything, ensures limitless adoration. Affected by this is not only mankind of all times, but also nature with flora and fauna. According the universality and globality of this total change of existence, the apocalypse uses for that some particular symbols of holiness, moored by special numbers such as the 7 or the 12 or the 24 or 144,000 and so on. As has already been said, paranormal extrasensory perception may allow insights into otherwise hidden things if someone is suitable for them. John of Patmos undoubtedly was best suited for it. That's why he got his vision, in which his imagination became totally overwhelmed. As a result of such experience, he could use only still pictures and symbols for his description.
Quite exactly, Evie. As John saw it, he had to write that down at the same time. As stated in Revelation chapter 1, verse 19, now write what you see, what is, and what is to take place hereafter. It is clear that with the abundance of images shown, only a fraction of them would be able to remember. As you can recognize here lightly, the apocalypse is more like a symphony than a chronological reporting. 4. It is impossible to say whether the temporal sequence of the events presented agrees with the temporal reality. But, in the end, this is without meaning, because the events are obvious different perceptions of a central event. This central event is evidently the opening of the 7 seals by the world originator, who only for it has become the temporal lamb. 4. The sealed book as such is not treated in the vision, whereas the opening of the 7th seal takes up the most space. It seems to be in such a way that with the seal openings, at the same time, also the book contents with are opened. Ergo, the 7 seals are not a special lock for the book, but merely a symbol of the incomprehensibility of the book content. From today's point of view, as a misunderstood book, we have virtually, in direct comparison, the Big Bang, with its entropic evolution, to our universe and world. Without clarification by the cosmic originator, according to chapter 5 of Revelation, the universal existence could never be understood. Especially in the case of the cosmology, dominating all media, which bases its explanation solely on physics and mathematics. The most important question concerning the cause and meaning of existence, in general, cannot and will not be answered by it. What remains is a profound helplessness, which has always plagued mankind and led to the formation of religions and beliefs. But because religions, with their obvious irrationality, have recently become obsolete, a mental vacuum has arisen. This is hoped to be filled with an intense attention to the temporal moment, according to the motto, Carpe Diem. So translated to English, and in freestyle, use and enjoy every day. It could be your last one at any time. Instead of using his temporal life for eternal life, with the motto, Carpe Diem, it is wasted in and over time. This is recognized by some spiritually conscious people, and then one tries to escape this trap. Of course, not with the turn to the world originator, but with an escape into spiritual speculation. The belief in reincarnation is very attractive for many people because they believe that they could with it survive their temporal death. Because of the theodicy problem, one wants to have nothing to do with the world originator, who is conceivable at least. It does not help if, as with the apocalypse, the world originator grants a hypertemporal view of the world history. Because bewildering pictures and symbols are unfortunately not suitable to make their something few, clear, and comprehensible. And thus, it must leave compelling of the person of the world originator to create clarity first once for itself. Clarity about himself and his universe, which was generated by him as primordial energy, which he embodies therefore, and from him, by Big Banging self-repulsion, is operated. If he is the only person who knows about the general and specific causes of existence, that is not so bad at first. For, with the end of the time world, everyone will participate in the person of the world originator, and thus, also in his knowledge. As has already been said, the participation of the individual in the universal person takes place through the exchange of identities. The old identity of the time world finishes with its expiry, and will be replaced with the new identity, which was achieved through the self-victim of the world originator. Is it right so, Evie?
In the past, salvation was said and meant according to the Lord's Prayer, where it says, "Deliver us from evil." The Apocalypse, however, does not speak of salvation, but brings images and symbols of a mankind following the Lamb. The overcoming is there the mentioned keyword, enabled by the blood of the Lamb symbolically. In contrast to the non-salvation of all those which could not do the self-overcoming and world-overcoming. Therefore, your concept of foundation is much more accurate than the general concept of salvation. And also the identity exchange has been very well recorded and explained by you. Antiquity did not yet know the concept of personal identity, for it had only come into being in modern times with psychology. In the Apocalypse, instead of identity, there is talk of a new name or stone that nobody knows except the recipient. As everyone knows, personal identity as a mental state cannot be externally recognizable. In the same way, one cannot look at a person, whether he is an idiot or a genius. The old identity of the time world is attributed in the vision to the beast and its name, with terms such as dragon, serpent, Satan, and so on. The mark on the forehead mentioned in this connection is the number 666, so the number of the beast or its name, as it is called there. It is absolutely correct to see the time world as a single animal person with all the negative attributes mentioned in the book of Revelation. For the universe is basically and always embodied only by a single universal person who is the world originator. And so in the time world, only the world originator can be that world temporal beast. For in the time, as a result of entropy, of the primordial energy, with becoming and passing away, a murderous world evolution is embodied. This forces the world originator in a confrontation and struggle with himself. Because in order not to be that murderous 666 beast, he has to become its polar opposite and in the process transform himself in a perfect human. Therefore, the universal world evolution is at the same time also the world courthouse in which the world originator, as the universe in person, is judging himself. In this way, only a single all-embracing world basic act is sufficient to the being with which it establishes and ensures its existence. From this perspective, the Apocalypse is better understood, where everything seems to flow into each other, into a single oversized affair. It is actually true gnosis that the world originator, as universe in person, carries out his court process over the world as a court process over his own person. As discussed earlier, he divides himself into subject and object because he can only act on himself in this way. And then in two ways, so as a world judge and a self-judge, and also as a world originator and self-originator. With only one universal zero as beginning and ending in one, origination and judgment must be the two sides of an identical act. Here again we remind once more the causality law, where the end effect has to effectuate the initial cause. So the Big Banging self-rejection as the initial cause up to an end effect, which is the all-embodying universal person. Once all this has been accomplished, then its new identity is that of the completed universal God of eternity, called the Lord. The Apocalypse speaks in this context of the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. And in conclusion, quite simply, of God the Eternal Almighty.
What I notice about the number of the animal, so 666 EB, is the obvious reference to sexuality. First of all, one has to imagine what constitutes the life of an animal in nature. Well, essentially it's limited to eating and reproduction. which also includes intelligent behaviors, as far as they are even present in some species. Therefore, in the past, sexuality was attached to the reputation of animal and ape. 3 times 6 as the number 666, so this results in a sort of supersexuality, as it is in the case of human. Moreover, his sexuality of an almost unlimited long-term readiness differs very much from those limited ones in the animal kingdom. I think it's no coincidence that the 666 animal number can be perfectly applied to human sexuality. Also, the Latin linguistic root with sexus for gender and the sex for a number admits no other application. Psychology and biology confirm the normally given enormous importance of the sexuality in the life of everybody. Then, the self and world overcoming, demanded by the apocalypse, will also have to include the sexuality with. That makes this demand generally more hopeless, since overcoming is always ruthless to realize. Another reference, or other clue, to sexuality is not found in Revelation. Is that the reason for the sexual hostility of the Christian churches? You can only speculate about that, but we should not be interested in it here, because it does not matter. Finally, in Revelation chapter 21, verse 22, is said, "And I saw no temple in the city, for its temple is the Lord God, the Almighty, and the Lamb." At the time world end have retired then, with such revealed circumstances, all churches, with their beliefs. And, with the churches together, all religions, and all world explanation models, have also disappeared, of course. All of these events, which were seen in John's visionary revelation, encompass entirely the temporal world events. For us, the time is a chronologically causal sequence of events, as it is registered by our consciousness. Actually, however, everything is being in a constant change, and does it, beyond of our consciousness. The reality of yesterday can be tomorrow another one, because the forces of the apocalypse are mind-altering. Better said, the world originator, as the universe in person, who gives the time instruction, in which direction time has to develop. Up to the end of the universal time world, from that, everything will be seized, at his time, at his place. Just as it cannot be otherwise possible, with a universe existing as a universal zero. The best for this one, who knows how to prepare in his time for it, spiritually and emotionally. With it, we come to the end of our sequence, from which we hope that it is well taken up and is understood. And also the best for people which have with it all no problems. Okay, is this the last sequence? It could be very possible. Use your chances.